My name is Sergeant Rosie Pierce, and at 27 years old, after 8 years of service in the United States Army, I came home in my Class A Army service uniform. Not for a parade, but to bury my grandmother, the last person who had ever loved me unconditionally. Inside the cold living room of Blackwood Ranch, a place that once smelled of my grandmother's baking, there was now only the cheap perfume of Morgana, the woman my father brought home. As the lawyer finished reading the will, leaving the entire ranch to me, she smiled a brazen smile, placed a hand on her stomach, and announced to everyone, "Well, that settles that. This house needs a real matriarch, not a soldier who's never around." My father, Alistair, wouldn't even look at me. He turned away and muttered, just loud enough for me to hear, "You abandoned her when she needed you most. This is the price you pay." A lump formed in my throat, but a soldier doesn't cry. Before I tell you my story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe if you've ever felt like a stranger in your own home, and if you believe the hardest battles are sometimes fought right on your own doorstep. The last of the mourners finally left, their sympathetic murmurs fading into the silence of the vast Montana sky. The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing me inside a house that was no longer a home. It was just a structure, cold and alien, haunted by the ghost of what it used to be. My dress uniform felt stiff and out of place. Without a second thought, my boots found their familiar path, carrying me toward the staircase, toward the one place I thought I could still retreat to, my childhood bedroom. I reached the top of the stairs and put my hand on the old brass doorknob. It wouldn't turn. It was locked. For a moment, I just stood there, my hand frozen on the knob, the cold metal a stark symbol of my new reality. "Oh, Rosie, dear." Morgana's voice, sickly sweet, drifted up from behind me. The soft jingle of keys followed her. She held one out, a shiny, new-looking key that didn't belong on the old iron ring. "That's Vesper's room now. We needed the space. Your things are down in the shed." I looked from her smiling face to the key, then back to the locked door. There was nothing to say. Arguing would be an engagement, a concession of emotion she didn't deserve. So I just nodded, my neck stiff. I took the key from her outstretched hand, its sharp edges dug into my palm. The walk to the old tool shed felt longer than I remembered. The crisp autumn air bit at my cheeks. The shed door groaned open, revealing a cramped space that smelled of rust, damp earth, and gasoline. And there they were, my things. A life packed into a half-dozen U-Haul boxes, tossed carelessly beside a rusted-out tiller and a pile of old tires. They hadn't just been moved, they'd been discarded. On top of the box marked photographs and mementos, a dirty, distinct boot print was stamped across the cardboard. They had stood on my past. They had literally walked all over my memories. My training kicked in, a cold, clear voice in my head. Observe and report. Do not engage. I reached down, my movements precise and controlled, and brushed the dried mud from the box. The simple act of cleaning the dirt off felt like a small, silent rebellion. The calmness on my face only served to magnify the cruelty of their actions. That evening's dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The heavy scent of burnt steak hung in the air, a culinary crime in a kitchen where my grandmother, Ilara, had produced decades of perfectly cooked meals. My father, Alistair, sat at the head of the table, methodically working his way through a six-pack of Coors Light, his eyes fixed on nothing. Opposite me, Vesper, Morgana's daughter, was glued to her phone, the tinny, obnoxious sound of some TikTok dance challenge echoing through the strained silence. Morgana, playing the gracious hostess, placed a piece of charred meat on my plate. "I do hope you like it well done, Rosie," she said. My grandmother used to say that burning a steak was a sign of a troubled mind. I cut into the meat, chewing mechanically. After a few agonizingly quiet minutes, I decided to ask, "What happened to Grandma's armchair? The one she always kept by the fireplace. The one where she sat every evening, her knitting needles clicking softly, a sound that had been the peaceful soundtrack to my childhood." Morgana paused, dabbing her lips with a napkin. a beautiful hand-embroidered linen napkin, one of my grandmother's. "Oh, that shabby old thing," she answered with a breezy laugh. "Heavens, it was an eyesore. I had it hauled to the dump last month. It was falling apart." As she spoke, she carelessly knocked over her glass of red wine. The dark liquid bled across the white tablecloth. Without missing a beat, she grabbed another of my grandmother's embroidered napkins and began sopping up the mess, grinding the deep red stain into the delicate, hand-stitched flowers. I watched her, my knuckles turning white as I gripped my fork. She wasn't just throwing away a chair or ruining a napkin. She was systematically erasing every trace of the woman who built this home. She was salting the earth of my memory. I didn't say a word. I just finished my meal in silence. Sleep was impossible that night. The silence in the house was louder than Vesper's videos. I slipped out of the cold shed and walked to the front porch, wrapping my arms around myself against the biting wind. Under the vast, star-dusted canopy of the Montana night, I saw a familiar silhouette leaning against the far fence line. Jedediah Stone. Jed had been the ranch foreman since before I was born. He was a man carved from the Montana landscape itself, tough, quiet, and fiercely loyal. I walked over, my boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't turn around right away. He just stared out at the dark fields. "Heard the news, kid," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough like gravel. "Heard what they did in there." He finally looked at me, his weathered face etched with a sorrow that mirrored my own. Alara. She didn't pass peaceful, not with them around. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He just understood. From his coat, he pulled out an old metal thermos and handed it to me. It was still warm. "Hot tea," he said. "Figured you could use it." The simple warmth of the thermos in my hands was the first genuine kindness I'd felt since I'd returned. It was a small anchor in a storm of hostility. "If you need anything," he said, tipping his worn-out hat, "my place is just down the road. Always." My fingers trembled as I pried the loose panel from the back of the armoire. It came away with a soft groan of old wood, revealing a dark, hollow space. Reaching inside, my hand closed around something solid. I pulled it out into the sliver of moonlight filtering through the window. It was a small cedar box, probably an old cigar box my grandfather had kept. Simple and unadorned, yet I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, I was holding the heart of this house. I sank to the cold, hardwood floor, pulling the box into my lap. This was Alara's memory box. This was the treasure Morgana's purge had missed, the soul of Blackwood she hadn't been able to find. Lifting the lid, a scent washed over me, so powerful it was like stepping back in time. It wasn't just the smell of dried lavender and old paper, it was the smell of safety, the smell of Sunday afternoons, the smell of unconditional love. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, lay the artifacts of a life well lived. A black and white photograph of my grandparents on their wedding day, looking impossibly young. My grandfather, Orion, handsome in his Marine Corps dress blues, and Alara, beautiful in a simple lace dress. There was a tiny faded blonde curl, tied with a blue ribbon, my father's first haircut. And beneath that, a stack of letters, bound with a frayed satin ribbon. I carefully untied the ribbon. The letters were addressed to me, Sergeant Rosie Pierce, at the generic address of my last deployment. But they had never been mailed. The stamps were fresh, the postmarks absent. My heart began a heavy, painful rhythm as I unfolded the first one. The handwriting was my grandmother's, elegant but shakier than I remembered. "My dearest Rosie," it began. "The first snows came to the valley today. The world is clean and quiet, and it makes my thoughts turn to you. I miss you more than words can say. I only wish I could hear your voice. Morgana says you're somewhere very dangerous, that we mustn't disturb you. She says your work is too important. So I will write this and pray it finds you well." I read on, my throat tightening. Letter after letter told the story of the last 2 years. She wrote of her loneliness, of how Morgana was slowly changing the house, replacing comfortable furniture with cold, modern pieces. She wrote of my father, Alistair, growing more distant, disappearing into a bottle more each night. Another letter, dated 6 months before she died, was smudged with what looked like a teardrop. "She's taken to answering the phone for me," Ilara wrote. "She says it's to keep me from getting tired." A few of my old friends from town said they tried to call, but Morgana told them I was sleeping. "I feel like a prisoner in my own home, Rosie." Alistair doesn't see it. He just sees that the house is clean and dinner is on the table. He doesn't see that the soul is being scrubbed right out of it. "I pray for you every night, my sweet girl. I pray you come home soon." The lie my own father had thrown in my face, "You abandoned her," shattered. No. I hadn't abandoned her. I had been cut off from her. A single hot tear fell onto the page, mingling with the one my grandmother had shed months ago. We were crying together, across time and loss. I had been her only link to hope, and Morgana had severed it, isolating her to fade away alone. The cold fury from the night before began to solidify inside me, hardening from a fleeting emotion into something permanent. At the bottom of the box was her old recipe book, a worn leather-bound journal, its pages soft and stained with flour and butter. I flipped through the familiar pages, her famous buttermilk biscuits, Grandpa Orion's favorite pot roast. And then I found it. The page for her apple pie. Tucked into the crease was a folded piece of notepaper. Her final letter. "My Rosie. If you're reading this, then I suppose I've gone to join your grandfather. Don't you be sad. Your strength was never in your muscles, Rosie, but in that steadfast Pierce heart of yours. Remember what the Lord says in the book of Isaiah. Your grandfather left you the land, but I am leaving you the strength to keep it. Don't you let them win." I remembered then, a crisp autumn afternoon years ago. I was 10, standing on a stool in the kitchen, hands covered in flour as she showed me how to crimp the edges of the pie crust. The air smelled of cinnamon and nutmeg. "This recipe," she'd whispered, her voice a soft conspiracy, "is the legacy of the Pierce women. Don't you ever let it be lost, Rosie." It wasn't just a recipe, it was a promise. Her final note wasn't just a message, it was a final command, a transfer of power. Her words pointed me to my final discovery. On the nightstand beside her bed, just where it had always been, was her old King James Bible. Its leather cover was cracked and soft from a lifetime of use. I picked it up, and it fell open to a page in the Old Testament, as if waiting for me. A single passage was underlined with a careful, steady pencil line, Isaiah 41:10. "Fear thou not, for I am with thee, be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will strengthen thee, yea, I will help thee, yea, I will uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness." I read the words over and over. For a soldier who had faced down fear in the deserts of Afghanistan, who had seen death and prayed for deliverance, these weren't just comforting platitudes. They were practical, tactical. It was a confirmation that I was not alone in this fight. I had God, I had the legacy of my grandparents, and now I had a clear objective. I stood up, my movements no longer tired but filled with purpose. I gently placed the letters, the recipe book, and the photograph back into the cedar box and closed the lid. I slid it back into its hiding place and replaced the panel. Her secrets were safe again. The grief was still there, a heavy weight in my chest. But now, it had a shape. The sorrow had a direction. The pain had been forged into a purpose. I was no longer just a mourner. I was the guardian of Blackwood. And my duty had just begun. My grandmother's secret gave me a mission, and a mission is something I understand. It clarifies the mind, it silences the noise. So, I accepted my new billet in the shed without a single word of protest. To Morgana, it was a banishment, a final humiliation. To me, it was a tactical advantage, an outpost, a forward operating base. I spent the next 2 days fortifying my position. The dusty, cluttered shed, which had been a symbol of my displacement, became my sanctuary. I worked with the methodical efficiency of a soldier setting up camp in hostile territory. I found an old army cot in the rafters, scrubbed it down, and set it up with my sleeping bag. Corners squared, blanket pulled taut. My uniforms and civilian clothes were hung from a makeshift rack, perfectly spaced and aligned. I cleared a corner, setting up a small folding table with my laptop and a standard-issue green logbook. Every item had a purpose and a place. The chaos of the main house, the overflowing laundry baskets, the dirty dishes left in the sink, stayed on the other side of the lawn. In here, there was order. There was control. My fob was secure, out of sight from the enemy. A place where I could think, plan, and operate without interruption. My days fell into a grueling rhythm, a series of small, calculated humiliations designed by Morgana. She treated me like a hired hand, assigning me the most backbreaking chores she could think of. I was to mend the barbed wire fence out in the north pasture, a task that had me working for hours in a cold, persistent drizzle. I cleaned the gutters, choked with a decade's worth of pine needles and wet leaves. I spent a full day splitting and stacking firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe against oak the only sound breaking the silence. I did it all without complaint. In my mind, this wasn't punishment. This was maintaining the infrastructure of my base. Every repaired fence post, every cleared gutter was me reclaiming a small piece of Blackwood. The psychological attacks were more subtle and far more infuriating. One morning, I spent 2 hours mowing the front lawn. The scent of fresh-cut grass a welcome change from the mustiness of the shed. The lawn looked neat, cared for, the way my grandmother always kept it. Not 10 minutes after I'd finished, Vesper sauntered out the front door with her little designer dog. She walked it directly onto the perfect green expanse I had just created and let it do its business. "Oops, so sorry," she called out, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. He's just so used to his routine. I stopped what I was doing and just looked at her. I didn't yell. I didn't say a word. I just met her gaze, and for a second, the cold, flat stare of a sergeant who had seen far worse things than a spoiled brat with a dog seemed to unnerve her. She tugged on the leash and hurried back inside. I turned, retrieved a shovel from the shed, and cleaned up the mess. My silence, I was learning, was more unsettling to them than any angry outburst could ever be. With my base established, I moved on to the next phase of my operation: reconnaissance. I began a simple campaign of observation, of human intelligence gathering, human. Nothing overt, nothing suspicious. I just watched, and I listened. And I took notes in my green logbook every night. I mapped out their patterns. Morgana had a habit of taking a phone call on the back porch every night after 10, pacing back and forth in the dark. My father, Alistair, had started hiding bottles of whiskey in the garage, tucked behind a stack of old tires. Vesper was constantly receiving packages from Amazon and Sephora, a steady stream of expensive, useless things that piled up in her room. My reconnaissance extended beyond the property line. When I drove the old ranch truck into town for supplies, I started talking to the other local ranch hands, men who had known my family for decades. I'd ask about the price of feed, the long-range weather forecast, just general small talk. And through that, I began to piece together a picture. One of the hands from the neighboring property mentioned offhandedly that he'd seen Morgana having coffee in town a few weeks back with a real estate developer, a slick character named Kale who had a reputation for being a shark. She wasn't just settling in, she was sizing up the prize. After a week of this, my logbook was filled with observations, times, and names. It was time to consult with my only ally. That evening, I walked down the long dirt road to Jed's small, tidy cabin, my logbook tucked under my arm. The warm glow from his kitchen window was a beacon in the twilight. He let me in without a word, just a nod of his head, and pointed to a chair at his small wooden table. The air inside was warm and smelled of brewing coffee and beef stew. I opened my logbook and laid it on the table. Like a soldier briefing a commanding officer, I presented my findings. Short, factual, and to the point. I detailed their routines, their spending, the hushed phone calls, and the meeting with the developer. "They're going to sell it, Jed," I finished, my voice low and certain. "Or at least, sell off parcels of it. She's gutting Blackwood from the inside out." Jed listened, his old eyes fixed on me, missing nothing. He took a long sip of his coffee, then nodded slowly, a grim look on his face. "Figured as much," he rumbled. He leaned forward, his weathered hands resting on the table. Your grandfather, Orion, he was a smart man. He saw this coming. He knew Alistair was weak. He paused, and his gaze sharpened with a new intensity. He left something for you, Rosie. Not in the will. Something else. An ace in the hole. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned in, waiting. But you're going to have to prove what they're up to first, Jed continued. He set it up so that you'd have to fight for it. He wanted to be sure you had the Pierce grit in you. Jed's words were like a flare in the darkness, confirming everything my gut had been telling me. There was a path to victory. There was a weapon waiting for me. And now, I finally knew what I was fighting for. Before we continue, if you've ever had to quietly gather your strength while being underestimated, hit that like button to show you're on my side. And let me know in the comments, what's one small thing that gives you strength in a tough situation? Just a simple word will do, like coffee or music. It's amazing what keeps us going. I left Jed's cabin that night with a renewed sense of purpose. The cold Montana wind didn't seem so biting anymore. I had a mission, I had intelligence. And now I had the promise of a trump card. The war for Blackwood was just beginning. Jed led me not to the main house, but to the old root cellar, a place I hadn't set foot in since I was a child. The air inside was cool and smelled of damp earth and potatoes. It was a place Alistair and Morgana, with their modern sensibilities, would never think to look. Jed lit a lantern, casting flickering shadows across the stone walls and dusty wine racks my grandfather had built by hand. He stopped at a section holding old preserves. Your grandpa told me, Jed, if the day ever comes when that girl of ours needs a real soldier in her corner, you give her this. He reached behind a row of mason jars, his fingers finding the edge of a loose fieldstone in the wall. He worked it free, revealing a small dark cavity. Inside was a small metal lockbox. He pulled it out and handed it to me. It was heavy, solid. The opposite of the flimsy promises and cruel words that now filled the rooms above us. I opened the box. There was no money, no jewels. Just a single, old-fashioned skeleton key and a short, handwritten letter on my grandfather's stationery. Rosie. This key opens my safe deposit box at the First National Bank in town. Inside is everything you need to protect our land. I trust you, my little soldier. Always have. Orion. My little soldier. The words blurred as my eyes filled with a sudden, hot sting. It was the validation I had craved from my father, the unwavering faith I hadn't realized I'd missed so desperately. I closed my fist around the cold, heavy key, feeling the warmth of my grandfather's trust seep into my bones, a shield against the coldness of the world. Back in Jed's warm, cozy kitchen, the savory smell of his famous beef stew filled the air. He ladled a generous portion into a bowl for me. Eating the thick, hearty stew, I felt a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the food. It was the warmth of an alliance, of not being alone. He was a fine man, Jed said, sitting across from me. A Marine, through and through. Semper Fi was more than a motto to him. It was how he lived. I remembered. Grandpa Orion was a man of few words, but decisive action. He was the one who taught me discipline and honor long before the army did. I remembered being 12, him taking me out to the West Pasture with a .22 rifle and teaching me how to breathe, aim, and squeeze, never flinching. He taught me how to read a topographical map, how to find true north. But his most important lesson was unspoken, demonstrated through his life. You never back down from a fight when you're in the right. Jed seemed to read my thoughts. You know, about 15 years ago, a big developer from California offered him a fortune for this place, wanted to build a golf course and luxury condos. He shook his head, a small smile on his face. Orion didn't even blink. He just told the fella, I can't sell my wife's memories or my granddaughter's childhood. That was the end of it. He looked me straight in the eye. His only real fear in this life was that Alistair's weakness would one day undo everything he'd built. He's been preparing for this day for a long, long time, Rosie. The next morning, I drove my grandfather's old Ford F-150 into town. The familiar rumble of the engine was a comforting sound. I felt a nervous tremor in my hands, but it was overshadowed by a deep, steady resolve. The First National Bank was a brick building on Main Street, a place that felt like it hadn't changed in 50 years. The manager, a kind, elderly man named Mr. Abernathy, was a friend of my grandfather's. He greeted me not just with sympathy, but with a deep, quiet respect. "Rosie," he said, his eyes kind, "your grandfather told me you might be coming one day, said you were the toughest Pierce of them all." He led me down to the vault. The great steel door swung open, and he unlocked safe deposit box number 41-10. He slid out the long metal container and placed it on the table in a private viewing room, leaving me with a respectful nod. My hands were steady as I lifted the lid. Inside was a thick manila folder, bulging with documents. It was a meticulously organized arsenal. There were certified copies of all the original land deeds for Blackwood Ranch, clear and undeniable. Tucked beneath them was another handwritten will from my grandfather, this one explaining in stark, painful detail why he could not, in good conscience, leave control of the ranch to his own son. And then I found it. The ace in the hole. It was a thick legal document, bound in blue. The title on the front read, Agricultural Conservation Easement. I started reading, my pulse quickening. It was a legal agreement my grandfather had signed years ago with the Montana Land Reliance, a local conservation trust. The language was dense, but the meaning was crystal clear. Blackwood Ranch was permanently protected. The land could never be subdivided. It could never be used for commercial development. Its use was restricted forever to agriculture and open space. The fields, the streams, the rolling hills, they were all locked in time, preserved as a working ranch. Any attempt by Morgana to sell off parcels for development wouldn't just be a breach of the will, it would be illegal. The Conservation Trust would sue them into oblivion. A slow smile spread across my face. My grandfather hadn't just left me a piece of land. He had built a legal fortress around it. He had played a long game, anticipating his son's weakness and the greed of outsiders. I remembered a lesson he'd taught me over a game of chess. Never play a hand without knowing what your opponent is holding, and always, always save your queen for the final move. Morgana thought she was playing for the house. My grandfather had been playing for the soul of the land itself. She could have her cheap perfume and her burnt steaks. She would never touch the heart of Blackwood. I now had the ultimate defense, but Jed's words echoed in my mind. You're going to have to prove what they're up to first. Having the fortress wasn't enough. I had to catch them in the act of trying to tear it down. My objective was now clear. I needed undeniable proof of their conspiracy. The reconnaissance phase was over. It was time to set a trap. My grandfather's legal fortress was my ultimate defense, but a fortress is useless if you stay hunkered down behind the walls. To win, I had to shift from defense to offense. I needed to draw the enemy out into the open. It was time to go on the attack, silently and strategically. My next mission required new assets. Using my own savings, I placed an order on Amazon. 2 days later, a small, discreet brown box arrived. Inside was a set of 3 battery-powered Blink security cameras, small enough to be concealed in the palm of my hand, and a simple Wi-Fi hub. My surveillance network. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, I commenced what I mentally dubbed Operation Divine Eye. Dressed in dark clothing, moving with the practiced silence of a soldier on patrol, I placed the assets. The first camera went into the thick rose bush beside the back porch, its tiny lens aimed directly at the spot where Morgana took her nightly calls. The second was tucked onto a high shelf in the garage, hidden behind old paint cans, with a clear view of the area where my father kept his secret stash of whiskey. The last one was the riskiest. I placed it on the top shelf of the living room bookcase, camouflaged between 2 of my grandmother's old encyclopedias. Back in the safety of my fob, I connected the cameras to my laptop. The grainy night vision images flickered to life. The living room, the garage, the back porch. I had eyes on the key strategic locations of the battlefield. This wasn't an invasion of privacy. I was monitoring common areas. I was watching the territory where the conspiracy was unfolding. I had turned Blackwood Ranch into an intelligent operating environment. Now, I needed to force their hand. A passive enemy is an unpredictable one. I needed Morgana to accelerate her timeline, to make a mistake. So, I prepared some bait. I created a simple fake document on my laptop, typed up a few pages of legal jargon and impressive-looking numbers, and slapped a cover sheet on it. Blackwood Ranch Land Appraisal. Preliminary estimate for Montana Land Reliance. I printed it, put it in a folder, and left it, accidentally, on my small work table in the shed, just visible from the doorway. I knew Vesper's snooping habits would be more reliable than any Swiss watch. It took less than 24 hours. From my laptop, I watched on the live feed from a fourth camera I'd placed watching my own FOB. The shed door creaked open. Vesper slipped inside, casting nervous glances over her shoulder. She saw the folder, snatched it up, and her eyes went wide as she read the cover. She pulled out her phone, quickly snapped pictures of every page, then put the folder back, slightly askew, and scurried out. The bait was taken. The effect was immediate. Morgana, undoubtedly panicked by the thought of me working with the Conservation Trust, started moving faster. Her nightly phone calls became longer, more agitated. 2 nights after Vesper's little spy mission, I focused my full attention on the back porch feed. Morgana was pacing like a caged animal, her voice a furious whisper. I put on my headphones and activated the audio recording software on my laptop, amplifying the sound. Her words came through, sharp and venomous. She was talking to the developer Jed had mentioned, Kale. "I don't care what you have to do, just get the paperwork ready," she hissed. A pause. "The signature? I need her signature." "No, of course she won't sign it. The little brat thinks she's queen of the castle now. You just get the documents drawn up. I'll handle the rest." There was another long pause. I could hear Kale's faint, muffled voice on the other end. Then Morgana laughed, a low, ugly sound that made my blood run cold. "Oh, Alistair," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "Don't you worry about him. He's as dumb as a sheep. He'll do whatever I tell him to. Once this is signed and filed, you and I are on the first flight to Hawaii." My hand clenched into a fist. Hearing her talk about my father that way, the man she had broken and now controlled, was like a knife in my chest. He was weak, yes, but he was still my father. And she was mocking him, using him, planning to discard him. I saved the audio file, naming it Sigint Duru Evidence Alpha .mp3. It was the hard proof I needed of conspiracy and intent to commit fraud. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place the next afternoon. My phone buzzed with a text from Jed. Black pickup, Kale the developer, just pulled up to the lawyer's office on Main Street. My heart hammered against my ribs. I grabbed my keys and was in my grandfather's truck in 30 seconds, heading for town. I parked across the street, my position giving me a clear line of sight to the entrance of a small brick building with a sign that read, Law Offices of Gerald Fleming. I watched as Kale, a man in an expensive suit that looked out of place in our small town, got out of his truck. He was followed by a nervous-looking man in a rumpled suit. His lawyer, I presumed. But then the passenger door of Kale's truck opened and my world tilted. My father, Alistair, climbed out. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, stooped and pale, his hands trembling as he smoothed down his shirt. He looked haunted, a man being led to his own execution. He glanced around nervously before following Kale and the lawyer into the building. I didn't move. I just raised my phone, zoomed in, and took a series of clear, time-stamped photographs of the 3 of them walking into that office together. I had it all. The motive, the conspiracy, the intent to defraud. And now, the visual confirmation of my own father's complicity. They were in there right now, preparing a forged power of attorney or some other fraudulent document to try and steal my birthright. I put the truck in drive and turned back toward the ranch. There was a cold, hard certainty settling in my gut. The hour had arrived. The time for observation was over. It was time to end this war. I drove back from town with a block of ice where my heart should be. The image of my father, stooped and broken, following those sharks into the lawyer's office was burned into my mind. He had made his choice. He had chosen them over me, over his own parents' legacy. The grief of that betrayal was a heavy physical weight. But the sight that greeted me when I turned down the long gravel driveway to Blackwood was something far worse. It was a desecration. In the middle of the front yard, where my grandmother's prize-winning roses used to grow, a rusty burn barrel belched thick, acrid smoke into the clear autumn sky. Morgana and Vesper were standing beside it, laughing, tossing items into the flames. They were having a picnic while committing an atrocity. A banner of smoke and ash unfurled across the blue sky, a signal of the sacrilege happening below. They were cleaning out the shed, Morgana called, as if it were a spring cleaning. But I knew what was in that shed. They weren't burning junk. They were burning my grandmother. I put the truck in park and got out, my movements feeling slow and disconnected, as if I were moving through water. I could see the items now. Old paperback novels with yellowed pages, their spines broken from 100 readings. A thick photo album with plastic-covered pages, the kind every family had in the 80s. And then I saw it. A flash of familiar blue wool. My grandmother's half-finished knitting project, the shawl she had been making for me before she got too weak, the wooden needles still stuck in the yarn, was tossed carelessly onto the blaze. I started walking toward them, my boots crunching on the gravel. Each step was deliberate. Each step felt heavier than the last. They didn't notice me at first. Vesper was holding something in her hands, a thick piece of cardboard. It was the framed, black-and-white photograph of my grandparents on their wedding day, the one that used to sit on the living room mantel. "God, they look so frumpy, don't they?" Vesper said with a sneer. And then, with the casual indifference of someone tossing a piece of trash, she threw it into the fire. I watched as the flames licked at the edges of the frame. The old photo paper began to curl and blacken. The image of Orion and Alara, their faces so young and full of hope, the very foundation of this ranch, distorted in the heat, bubbled and then vanished into a flurry of gray ash. And in that instant, something inside me broke. All the discipline, all the training, all the orders I'd given myself. Observe and report. Do not engage. Shattered into a million pieces. This wasn't a strategic maneuver anymore. This wasn't about land or money. This was a violation. They weren't just burning things. They were burning the love that built this place. They were burning my soul. I didn't scream. I didn't charge. The rage that filled me was too immense for that. It was a cold, silent, white-hot fury. I reached the burn barrel, my presence finally registering with them. I picked up a long iron poker that was resting against the side, its metal cool against my palm. Calmly, methodically, I began to pull the smoldering remains of my grandmother's life from the flames. The singed cover of a book, the melted plastic of the photo album, the charred remnants of the wool shawl. Morgana stepped forward, placing a hand on her hip, her voice dripping with condescension. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Rosie, it's just some old junk. We're just making room." I stopped. I slowly turned my head, and for the first time since I'd come home, I looked Morgana dead in the eye. The air crackled between us. The smile on her face faltered. My voice, when it came out, was low, calm, and as cold and hard as Montana steel in January. "You have just made a fatal mistake," I said. "You underestimated your enemy." I saw a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. It was the first real emotion I had seen from her. She had mistaken my silence for weakness. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I didn't give them another glance. I dropped the poker, the clang of iron on gravel echoing in the sudden silence. I turned my back on them and the foul smoke and stalked toward the main house. I walked past my father, who was sitting in a stupor on the porch, a can of beer dangling from his hand. I didn't even look at him. He was just a ghost now, a hollow man in a house of thieves. I went up the stairs, straight to my old bedroom, Vesper's room. I took out the key Morgana had given me for the shed. The old locks were all the same. It turned with a satisfying click. I stepped inside, closed the door, and locked it behind me. I wasn't there to cry. I was there to prepare for war. I sat down at Vesper's vanity, pushed her makeup and junk aside, and opened my laptop. My fingers flew across the keyboard, my movements precise and efficient. I created a new folder on the desktop, Blackwood Assault. One by one, I moved all the files into it. The video of Vesper in the shed, the audio file of Morgana's phone call, the time-stamped photos of my father at the lawyer's office, the PDF of my grandfather's conservation easement, my arsenal. If you've ever reached that point where you just knew, that you could not stay silent 1 second longer, hit that like button right now. Let me know in the comments. Just type, "Enough is enough," if you know that feeling. Next, I opened a secure email client and typed a short, simple message to Jed. The subject line was one word: tonight. The body of the email was just two: "Be ready." I hit send. Finally, I stood up and stripped off my work clothes, stained with dirt and the soot of my grandmother's memories. I walked into the adjoining bathroom and turned the shower on, the water washing away the grime, but not the fury. I put on a clean pair of jeans and a crisp, button-down shirt. I combed my hair. I looked at the stranger in the mirror, the soldier with the cold, determined eyes. My grandfather had taught me to choose my battlefield. They had just chosen it for me, right here, at Blackwood. Tonight, this war ends. Locked in that room, I didn't waste a single second on emotion. The time for anger was over. Now was the time for cold, hard strategy. I sat before my laptop not as a grieving granddaughter, but as an operations officer preparing for a final assault. My first action was to marshal my assets. I created a new folder on the clean desktop, giving it a simple, clear title: Operation Blackwood. My movements were precise, my fingers clicking with purpose on the trackpad. I opened my evidence folder and began to organize my digital ammunition, renaming each file for tactical clarity. The video of Vesper snooping in my shed became 1. Surveillance. Vesper, infiltration. MP4. The audio of Morgana's treacherous phone call became 2. Sigint, Morgana, Kale, conspiracy, MP3. The photos of my father entering the lawyer's office became 3. Imagery, Alistair, collusion.jpg. And my grandfather's ultimate weapon, the conservation document, became 4. Legal conservation, easement.pdf. Each file was around in the magazine. I didn't need a rifle. My arsenal was right here, clean, organized, and undeniable. Before I closed the laptop, I performed one final check. I inserted a small encrypted USB drive into the port and copied the entire Operation Blackwood folder onto it. A good soldier always has a contingency plan, a backup. My phone vibrated on the table, a low hum against the wood. I checked the screen. It was a text from Jed. My heart rate quickened. Black pickup truck, Kale the developer, just pulled up the driveway. I took a slow, steadying breath. Showtime. I typed a quick reply. Roger that. A minute later, the phone rang. It was Jed. His voice was calm, but I could hear the underlying urgency. Rosie, they're all in the living room now. Kale, his lawyer, the whole damn circus. I closed my eyes, visualizing the layout of the house. The living room, one primary entrance, limited egress. Perfect, I said, my voice low and steady. All targets are in the kill zone. What's the plan? Jed asked. Jed, I said, my mind already 5 steps ahead. Can you do one more thing for me? I need you to make a phone call. I need you to call Mr. Abernathy, the bank manager. No, wait, better. Call Mr. Peterson at the Montana Land Reliance, the Conservation Trust. Tell him Sergeant Pierce requires his presence at Blackwood Ranch in 30 minutes. Tell him it concerns a breach of contract. Tell him to come as a witness. Consider it done, Jed said, and the line went dead. I now had my legal air support on the way. But there was one more weapon I needed, a different kind. Not for them, but for him. I walked over to the closet where Vesper's things were now hung. In the back, she had shoved the cedar memory box I'd found in my grandmother's armoire. I lifted the lid, the scent of lavender and history once again filling the small space. I reached past the letters and the photos of my grandparents. I was looking for something specific. I found it at the bottom. It wasn't in an album. It was just a loose photograph, a 4:6 print from the local pharmacy, its colors slightly faded. It was the last family picture we ever took together, a few months before the car accident that took my mother. We were at a county fair. My father, Alistair, was in the middle, his face split by a genuine, unforced grin. He looked happy. He looked alive. One arm was wrapped around my mother, and the other was holding a small, gap-toothed version of me, a giant cone of cotton candy in my hand. We were a family, whole, unbroken. This was my psyops weapon, my psychological operations, not designed to wound, but to shatter a carefully constructed reality. This was my silver bullet, and it was aimed directly at the heart of the man my father used to be. I carefully folded the photograph in half and slipped it into the breast pocket of my shirt, right over my heart. My final preparations were complete. I stood up, took one last look around the room that was once mine, and walked to the door. I unlocked it and stepped into the hallway, holding nothing in my hands but my cell phone. I started down the stairs. My boots made no sound on the old wooden steps. I moved with a fluid, practiced silence, a ghost in my own home. My breathing was even, my pulse steady. This was it. The final infiltration. The approach to the objective. From the bottom of the stairs, I could hear them. The sound of their victory. The clinking of glasses. Morgana's shrill laugh. The low murmur of men's voices, congratulatory and self-assured. I reached the doorway of the living room and paused, just out of their line of sight. They were all there, just as Jed had said. Morgana, Vesper, Cale, and his lawyer were gathered around the coffee table, raising glasses of cheap champagne. On the table was a stack of legal papers. And my father. My father was slumped in my grandmother's armchair, the new one, staring into his glass as if it held the answers to the universe. They were celebrating the death of my family's legacy. They were toasting their own greed. And they were completely, blissfully unaware that the angel of justice, or at least the sergeant of retribution, was standing right in their midst. I took one final deep breath. Then I stepped through the doorway. My calm voice cut through their laughter like a shard of glass. I think we need to talk. My voice sliced through their celebration, and 5 pairs of eyes snapped toward me in the doorway. The champagne glasses froze halfway to their lips. A stunned silence fell over the room, thick and immediate. You all look so cheerful, I said, walking slowly into the room. My eyes went to the stack of papers on the coffee table. Must be because of this. Morgana was the first to recover. She placed her glass down with a delicate click and gave me a triumphant, pitying smile. That's right, Rosie. It's a power of attorney document. Your father has agreed to transfer the administrative rights of the ranch to me, to family. Everything is perfectly legal. Legal, I repeated, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. I nodded slowly. All right, let's talk about the law. I held up my phone. With a few taps, I connected to the living room's smart TV. The 60-inch screen, a gaudy purchase of Morgana's, flickered to life, mirroring my phone's display. A row of neatly labeled files appeared. First, I said, my voice even and calm, let's watch a short video. Exhibit A. I pressed play. The grainy, time-stamped footage from my fobs filled the screen. The image of Vesper, her face illuminated by her phone, sneaking into my shed and snapping pictures of the fake land appraisal, was broadcast in high definition. Vesper made a small strangled noise and her face went the color of chalk. Morgana shot her a look of pure fury. Next, I said, not giving any of them a moment to breathe or formulate a defense, let's listen to an audio file. Exhibit B. Let's see just how legal this family arrangement is. I tapped the second file. Morgana's own voice, sharp and conspiratorial, suddenly filled the room, amplified by the TV's speakers. I need her signature. No, of course she won't sign it. You just get the documents drawn up. I'll handle the rest. Then came the part I had been waiting for. Oh, Alistair, don't you worry about him. He's as dumb as a sheep. He'll do whatever I tell him to. Once this is signed and filed, you and I are on the first flight to Hawaii. The effect was like a bomb going off in the room. My father, Alistair, shot to his feet as if he'd been electrocuted. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, horrified white. He slowly turned his head and stared at Morgana, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. Kale, the slick developer, physically took 2 steps away from Morgana, his hands raised slightly as if to say, "I'm not with her." Her co-conspirators were abandoning her on the battlefield. Morgana was stammering, her face a mask of disbelief and panic. That's been doctored. It's fake." And finally, I said, my voice cutting through her pathetic denials, "Even if you had managed to forge my signature on that document?" I paused, letting the weight of the word forge hang in the air. "It would be completely and utterly useless." I tapped the final file. The crisp black and white text of my grandfather's agricultural conservation easement filled the screen. I scrolled slowly, letting the key phrases shine. Perpetuity. No subdivision. Commercial development is strictly prohibited. This ranch, and every acre of it, is legally protected, I announced to the silent, horrified room. It can never be broken up or sold to developers. Your entire plan isn't just a violation of my grandmother's will, it's a felony. A deliberate attempt to breach a binding legal contract with the Montana Land Reliance. As if on cue, the front door opened. Jed stepped inside, his face grim and determined. He held the door open for the man behind him. Mr. Peterson, a distinguished gray-haired man in a tweed jacket, his expression serious and authoritative. He nodded at me. "Sergeant Pierce," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the law. "We received a call regarding a potential breach of the conservation agreement on this property. It seems we've arrived just in time." The room imploded. Morgana started shrieking, a string of incoherent accusations about me, about the will, about everything. Vesper burst into tears. Kale and his lawyer, seeing the official from the Land Reliance, began frantically stuffing papers into their briefcases, their eyes darting toward the exit like cornered rats. But I wasn't looking at them. My eyes were fixed on my father. He had collapsed back into the armchair, his body shrinking in on itself, his head buried in his hands. He was a broken man, brought down not by my attack, but by the weight of his own weakness. I walked slowly across the room, the chaos fading into a dull roar around me. I reached into my shirt pocket and took out the folded photograph. I didn't slam it down. I placed it gently on the coffee table in front of him. The joyful faces of a young family stared up at him from the faded print. My voice was quiet, so quiet only he could hear it over the ringing in his ears. "This was the man I used to know," I said softly, but every word was a hammer blow against his soul. A husband who loved his wife, a father who was proud of his daughter, a man who smiled like he meant it. I leaned in closer. "You let that woman in this house kill him. And tonight? Tonight you stood by and helped her burn my mother's memory to ash." He lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He looked from the photograph of the man he once was to my face, the face of the daughter he had betrayed. And for the first time in 8 long years, my father began to sob. Not the quiet tears of a drunk, but the deep, ragged, gut-wrenching sobs of a man who has just been forced to look at the wreckage of his own life. The battle for Blackwood was over. I had won. But standing there, listening to the sound of my father's heart breaking, it didn't feel like a victory. It just felt final. The explosion in the living room didn't end with a bang, but with a slow, pathetic fizzle. With Mr. Peterson from the Land Reliance standing there, his expression a stony mask of legal authority, there was no room for Morgana's lies. Faced with the very real threat of a lawsuit for felony fraud, a lawsuit they would unequivocally lose, she and Kale folded. There was no grand exit, no final dramatic confrontation. There was only the quiet, humiliating task of packing. Under the watchful, silent gaze of Jedediah Stone, Morgana and Vesper scurried around the house, throwing their clothes and gaudy possessions into suitcases. They didn't speak to me. They didn't even look at me. I was no longer an obstacle. I was the unmovable force that had broken them. I didn't say a word to them either. I just stood on the front porch, my arms crossed against the cold night air, and watched. I watched as Kale loaded their bags into his black pickup truck. I watched as Vesper shot one last, hateful glare at the house. And I watched as Morgana got into the truck without a backward glance. There was no joy in my victory, no satisfaction, just a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The kind you only feel after a long and brutal war. I stood there until the red glow of their taillights vanished at the end of the long dirt road, swallowed by the immense darkness of the Montana night. The enemy had been routed. The cost was yet to be counted. The next morning, I found my father. He wasn't in the house. I found him out in the west pasture, leaning against a fence post, staring at a section of barbed wire that had come loose. A section I had been scheduled to fix. He looked like a man who had aged a decade overnight. His eyes were puffy and bloodshot, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He saw me coming and straightened up, but it was a weak, hollow gesture. He started talking before I was even close, the words tumbling out in a desperate, rambling torrent. He talked about how lonely he'd been after my mother died, how Morgana had seemed so full of life, how he'd let his jealousy of my grandfather's love for me twist him into something ugly. It was a pathetic litany of excuses I had heard in pieces my whole life. Then, he did something I never expected. He sank to his knees in the damp dirt and reached for me, his hands grabbing the cuff of my work jeans. "Rosie, please," he sobbed, his face contorted in misery. "Please forgive me. Don't make me leave. This is my home." I stood perfectly still, letting his words, his tears, his desperation wash over me. I looked down at the top of his graying head, at this broken man who shared my blood, and all I could see was the image of my grandparents' wedding photograph curling into black ash in the fire. All I could hear was his voice, his own voice, muttering in the living room, "This is the price you pay." He had been right. This was the price. His price. Gently, but firmly, I pulled my leg free from his grasp. He looked up, his tear-streaked face full of a desperate, childish hope. It was a look that might have broken my heart a month ago. But I wasn't the same person who had stepped off that bus. "I'm not kicking you out," I said, and the sound of my own voice surprised me. It was flat, calm, and distant. I didn't call him Dad. The word felt like a lie. "But you can't stay here. Blackwood needs to heal, and so do I." The last glimmer of hope died in his eyes. He finally understood. My gaze held no hatred, no rage, but it held no warmth either. It was the polite, impenetrable look you give a stranger you'll never see again. I had drawn a line, not in the dirt, but in the space between us, and he knew he could never cross it again. He didn't argue. He just nodded, a single jerky motion, and pushed himself up from the ground. He walked back to the house and packed a single duffel bag with what little was truly his. He got into his old, beaten-up Dodge Ram and started the engine. I stood by the fence and watched him drive away. I watched until the truck was just a tiny speck on the horizon, until the trail of dust it kicked up had settled back onto the earth. A whole section of my life, the part that held a father and a family, had just vanished with that dust. I didn't cry. I just felt a profound, painful sense of release. It was the loneliest kind of freedom. The perimeter was now secure. The next few days were a purification ritual. Jed and I began the great cleansing of Blackwood. We were a silent, efficient team. We hauled all of Morgana's cheap, ostentatious furniture out to the curb with a free sign. We took down the gaudy synthetic curtains and let the clean, bright sunlight flood the rooms for the first time in years. We threw open every window in the house, letting the sharp, clean Montana wind sweep through the halls, chasing out the last lingering scent of cheap perfume and betrayal. It was an exorcism. I took the few precious items I'd rescued from the fire and, after carefully cleaning them, placed them back where they belonged. A few of my grandmother's books went back on the mantelpiece. A small singed corner of her shawl I draped over the rocking chair she should have had. The house began to breathe again. It started to feel less like a crime scene and more like a sanctuary. One afternoon, after all the work was done, I stood alone in the center of the quiet, clean living room. The silence was absolute. The battle was over. The enemy was gone. The land was safe. I had won. But standing there, in the echoing stillness, a single, heavy question settled over me. Now what? The question that had echoed in the empty living room, now what, found its answer not in a sudden revelation, but in the slow, steady rhythm of the changing seasons. As the harsh Montana winter loosened its grip and the first signs of spring appeared, so too did a new sense of purpose begin to thaw within me. Blackwood was no longer a battlefield to be won. It was a sanctuary to be nurtured. With Jed by my side, and with the quiet, unquestioning help of neighboring ranchers who seemed to understand that Blackwood was back in the right hands, we began the work of revival. We didn't just go back to the old ways. I took everything the Army had taught me about logistics, efficiency, and resource management and applied it to the ranch. We mapped out crop rotations like campaigns, managed supply chains for feed and seed, and streamlined the daily operations until the ranch was running more productively than it ever had before. My past and my future were no longer in conflict. They were working together. One crisp spring morning, I took a shovel and walked to the small, quiet hill where my mother, Serafina, was buried. Just below her simple headstone, I tilled a small plot of earth, my hands working the rich, dark soil. There, I planted a garden of lavender. As the tiny green shoots began to push their way toward the sun, I felt like I was planting a promise. I was telling her and myself that the soul of this place had not just been saved, but was beginning to grow anew. The answer to, now what, became clearer. Blackwood was too vast, its peace too profound to be kept for myself alone. I thought of the women I had served with, women who carried invisible wounds far heavier than any duffel bag, women who returned from war only to find themselves fighting a new one at home, a battle of reintegration and misunderstanding. I had a fortress. It was time to open the gates. I made a call to a veteran support center in Helena. I drove there the next week and laid out my plan. It wasn't charity, it was a new kind of deployment. I called it Serafina's Promise. We would offer a place at Blackwood for female veterans struggling with PTSD, anxiety, or the simple, crushing difficulty of finding their place in a world that no longer felt like theirs. They would not be employees. They would be comrades. They would come to the ranch for a season, to work the land, to tend the livestock, to feel the satisfying ache of physical labor under the vast open sky. They would trade the chaos of their memories for the quiet rhythm of the seasons. They would heal together. I had fought to save my family's legacy, and in doing so, I had discovered its true purpose, to become a sanctuary for my sisters in arms. The first two veterans arrived in early summer, both younger than me, both with the same guarded, haunted look in their eyes that I knew so well. We didn't talk much about the past. We talked about fixing irrigation lines, about the best way to shear a sheep, about the storm clouds gathering over the mountains. And slowly, day by day, I watched the tension in their shoulders ease. I heard their laughter, quiet at first, then louder, echoing across the fields. We were building a new kind of unit, one bound not by conflict, but by cultivation. One day in late August, a letter arrived in the mail. The return address was a post office box in a small town in Wyoming I'd never heard of. The handwriting was my father's. My hand was steady as I opened it. He wrote that he was sober now, working a steady job at a lumber yard. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't make excuses. He just wrote about his quiet life, about the mountains there. And he asked if the ranch was doing okay. He hoped it was. I read the letter twice. The man who wrote it was a stranger, a ghost from a different life. I felt a faint echo of sadness for the father I once had, but there was no anger, no bitterness. There was just distance. I folded the letter, slipped it into my grandmother's cedar memory box, and closed the lid. I did not write back. Not out of spite, but because that story was over. Our paths had diverged for good, and my own path was finally, blessedly, peaceful. The story ends here, on an evening just like this one. The sun is setting, painting the Montana sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. I'm standing on the highest hill of the ranch, the place my grandfather used to call the Captain's Perch. I'm no longer in my dress uniform, but in my work clothes, worn jeans, scuffed boots, and a simple flannel shirt. Below me, Blackwood is alive. The fields are green and lush. The lights in the ranch house are warm and inviting. From the open kitchen window, I can hear the sound of laughter. The easy, joyful sound of the women of Serafina's Promise, my sisters, preparing dinner together. I had come home to bury the last person who loved me, only to discover a new family waiting to be born. I had not just won a war for a piece of land, I had built a peace, a real and lasting peace from its ashes. I was no longer a soldier fighting in a faraway land. I was a soldier guarding the peace right here at home. The mission was complete. The new one had just begun. Thank you for listening to my story. The fight for Blackwood taught me that our truest legacy isn't what we inherit, but what we build from our scars. It's about finding the courage to draw a new map when the old one leads to heartbreak. If my journey resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and join our community here. And I'd be honored if you would share this story with just one person you know who needed to hear that they have the strength to guard their own peace. Thank you for being here.